Welcome to everyone who's joining us for our event today, A Future for All Workers, Technology and Worker Power. I want to start with thanking the Seiu Family Endowment for their generous support of our portfolio of work on how to foster an inclusive and equitable future for all workers. I also want to thank all of our brilliant speakers today for joining us. Before turning to our keynote, I have a few housekeeping notes. Each part of our agenda today will have a Q&A session following the keynote and then following each panel. All questions about the event's content go into the Q&A box, and all technical and logistical questions go into the chat box. We ask that you submit questions for the Q&A, including your first and last name, your institution or affiliation, and if the question is directed to a specific person, please indicate to whom your question is directed. This event is on the record and being recorded. Now to turn to Mary Kay Henry, who is the International President of the Service Employees International Union, and the first woman elected to lead the now 2 million member union. Her leadership at Seiu is rooted in a belief that Black, Brown, Pacific Islander, and white working people joining together is the key to making radical gains for all workers. She's led Seiu in major victories to improve the jobs of healthcare, property services, and public sector workers across the United States, Canada, and Puerto Rico. She's also the co-chair of California's Future Work Commission. So today she'll be giving some remarks on technology and worker power, and then I'll ask her a few questions, and then we'll take audience questions. Before turning to President Henry, I also just want to say what an honor it is to introduce her, since one of my first jobs out of college was working for Seiu Local 32BJ in New York City. It's the place where I learned about the dignity of work that is often considered low-skilled and how solidarity between workers can build a new future. Seiu has really been a leader in progressive and inclusive unionism, and I admire all the work you've done there. So over to you, President Henry.
Thank you so much, Kate. I'm going to call you my union sister, given your roots, and I want to thank you for including the 2 million members of the Service Employees International Union and the millions more fighting for 15 in a union as we speak, because the Center for Equitable Growth's work helps us to better understand how the economy is so often set up to enable a privileged few to race ahead while the rest of working people are left behind. Your research shines a light on how systemic racism has contaminated our country's legal, governmental, and economic systems, and how that injustice allows brutal inequalities to weaken our social fabric. And most importantly, Equitable Growth's research is giving working people clear, compelling evidence to make a case for the changes we need to create a more balanced, inclusive, and just economy. You help us imagine what we need to do to create a better future for all working families. We all know that technology will shape the future, so our union is very interested in today's discussions. 18 months ago, the governor of California invited me to represent SEIU and all working people to serve as the co-chair of California's Future of Work Commission. Since then, I've sat at a table with leaders from technology, unions, business, community organization, higher education, listening to experts and researchers from across these sectors. We heard a broad range of perspectives about how work is changing. We were asked to make recommendations about the kinds of jobs Californians could have in the decades to come, to consider the impact of technology on work and society, and how to get ready for the jobs of the future. We are still putting the final touches on this report, and I look forward to sharing our conclusions soon. But we reached a consensus that California cannot just think narrowly about which kind of jobs might fade away and which kind of jobs might be gained, that we had to think bigger. We have to reimagine the basic social compact between employers, government, and working people. And while I can't get into the details about the specific recommendations yet, I did want to share one crucial thing on behalf of service and care workers across the country. The only way we will be able to create a social compact that is equitable and just will be to make sure that working people have a seat at the table through their union. Joining together in a union is the single best way for working people to gain the collective power necessary to demand that workers share in the benefits created by technology-driven change. We know that throughout human history, wealthy and powerful people have attempted to use technology to take more time, more labor, and more creativity from workers to create more profit for themselves. Time after time, many of those same powerful have tried to divide us based on race, gender, or birthplace. And for the rest of the 21st century, working people are going to find new ways to organize across our differences and to join together against new attempts to divide us against each other. Many of you at this conference are doing important work, examining how technology is used against working people. But what I hear from service and care workers inside our union and across the fight for 15, many are eager for technology to be used both to make their jobs more rewarding and to improve the quality of care and services they provide. Here's one example. The Affordable Care Act included funding to invest in a project to give caregivers access to technology to improve the quality of care they provide. Home care workers who provide care for seniors and people with disabilities were often frustrated because it was so difficult to get the help for their clients whose health was taking a bad turn. Caregivers wanted to respond quickly if they noticed blood pressure changes or skin color changing. And because it was difficult for the home caregivers to connect with the client's primary care physician to assess how to respond, home care workers were often left with no other choice but to take their clients to a hospital for evaluation. And all of us know hospitalization is, of course, very expensive. It can be stressful and dangerous, putting clients at risk of getting an infection while in the hospital. But in this experiment, home care workers were armed with the access to get to their client's primary care physician using smartphone and tablet-based technology. With technology that empowered them to act as a more effective early warning system, home care workers reduced hospitalizations by more than 50% over 6 months. Fewer unnecessary hospitalizations meant that home care workers can improve the quality of life for the people that they work so hard to take care of. The members of SEIU are determined to push for changes like this that unleash the talent, skills, and know-how of caregivers on the front lines of our society. And that's why we're fighting so hard to win a seat at the table when decisions get made. A week ago today, home care workers in 15 cities organized collective actions to push Congress to raise the minimum wage to $15. Brenda Williams was one of these caregivers taking action. She's in Tampa, Florida. She's been a caregiver for 17 years, but she's still paid only $10 an hour with no paid sick time, no paid health care, and no other paid time off. Brenda deals with chronic back pain after all these years of lifting patients and putting their wheelchairs into her trunk. And she was exposed to COVID and at one point thought she might not survive. But she pulled through, and she continues to help lead the fight to transform caregiving jobs into stable work that pays enough to support a family. On the same day last week that home care workers were taking action, fast food workers in 15 cities organized strikes for 15 and the right to form a union. Gloria Machuca joined the strike in Houston. She went on strike because she's tired of McDonald's paying her so little that she can't afford groceries and rent at the same time. She's tired of working during catastrophic pandemic without paid sick leave. McDonald's, the second largest employer in the world, is an aggressive user of scheduling technology that uses algorithm to make sure that workers like Gloria are as busy as possible every minute of her shift. The scheduling software's algorithm mandates that workers perform at a grueling pace throughout the day. Her family lost electricity and water during the Texas weather disaster and had very little food. They've regained power, but still no water, and she's worried about how they will afford their power bill after electric companies jacked up prices during the crisis. Gloria, Brenda, and all working people across our country deserve to have a say about our work. Humankind is still a long way from developing a robot that could do all the complex, difficult tasks needed to care for a person with disabilities in their home. But Brenda Williams and other home care workers could help design technology that stops spinal injuries by helping caregivers move clients and lift wheelchairs. Gloria Machuca and McDonald's workers should have a voice about how the software that sets the pace of their workload. We all deserve the power to help shape our community's future, to make the years to come better for our children and grandchildren. We all deserve to be respected, protected, and paid fairly. We must use the power of technology to make life more stable, more fulfilling, and more satisfying for everyone, no matter what kind of work we do, no matter what zip code we live in. We're grateful to the Washington Center for Equitable Growth for organizing this event. We look forward to listening to your ideas about how to use technology for the benefit of all working Americans. And we're ready to stand alongside of you as we build the collective power it will take to win the future we want. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, President Henry, for your remarks. It was really great to hear both stories about workers and your thoughts on how collective power can ensure that workers are sharing in the gains of technology. So I'll start by asking you a few questions of my own, and then I'll open it up to questions from the audience. To get started, technology has been integrated into so many aspects of our work, from the people on these panels and the audience who are allowing our jobs into our home through Zoom, to workers in warehouses who are wearing monitoring equipment to keep track of the pace of their tasks. What are some of the biggest concerns of workers about new digital and mobile technologies being integrated into work? And how does it change based on a worker's economic position and the sector of the economy that they're in?
I think the biggest concern from the frontline workforce is being involved in the development of the technology, because nobody understands how to do a job more effectively than human beings who've been doing the work for years. We need to include frontline workers in the process of developing the technology and for enhancing and improving care, improving services, instead of just squeezing more and more from people. I had an experience during the Future of Work Commission where we were at the Stanford Innovation Lab, and we represent the service and care and maintenance workers on the University of Stanford's campus. And one of the maintenance guys listened to an artificial intelligence presentation and recalled to me the use of drones to survey the trees that he's cared for on that campus for 25 years. And he watched the technicians have the drones look at the trees, and he kept wishing the drone was used to look at this part or that part, because he knew the tree so well that he could have helped inform how the drones were used to assess what maintenance needed to be done. And that's just like a minor example of the combination of the human experience with the technology actually being able to enhance his work in a way that he was thrilled, frankly, that he didn't have to get up on a ladder any longer and risk like spinal injury, but wanted to help inform how the drone was used. That's just a key illustration of the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, as great as some technologies might be, humans are what make it work in the first place.
Yeah,
exactly. And so some of the fastest growing jobs in the economy are low wage service work. So you described particularly caregivers in your remarks who are doing this really essential job and often paid very little. And it's an area of work where monitoring and workplace control are especially prevalent. How has the labor movement pushed back on surveillance at work?
Well, in the parts of the labor movement where we have collective bargaining, it becomes a discussion and demand at the bargaining table to push back on surveillance and curtail the use of that mechanism for disciplinary action of the workers. And in the best cases, technology is used in a way that enhances the job. So I can think of the housekeepers in Kaiser Sunset in LA who were frankly excited about the introduction of robotic AI cleaning systems, but wanted to work with the designers because they were sure that corners and other key places in rooms were going to be hard for robots to access. And they had a lived experience of how to reduce hospital-acquired infections. And housekeepers see themselves as the front line of defense on reducing hospital infection. And so that's an example of how a unionized hospital worker has the ability through collective bargaining to think about the introduction of the technology as a way to keep achieving the shared goals of his unit.
Yeah, great, thank you. And so the last question I'll ask is, research has shown that while education is often correlated with pay levels, worker power is really a primary determinant of job quality. I think, the evidence shows, from both research and your experience working at SEIU, that power really matters. So how does SEIU work towards ensuring that worker in education comes with power to lead to better jobs for workers?
Well, ask any adjunct professor who's been working in American higher ed to tell you about how education affects income. There's a growing movement of people who work in fields like higher ed and digital media who are showing that union membership can be a far more powerful tool for improving the quality of life than an advanced degree necessarily is. Americans need both: access to affordable quality education and access to the solidarity to join together and bargain through a union to fight for a better life.
Great, thank you. So I'll turn to a couple audience questions for our last 8 minutes or so with you. We have a question from Peter Fugio from University of Chicago. Do you see government regulations as a substitute or a complement for collective bargaining around non-wage issues such as staffing ratios, scheduling practices, just cause dismissals? Should these laws include as many workers as possible or target non-union sectors with the worst labor practices?
I think I see regulation as a complement, and also it can be an accelerant to expanding workers' power. So it can work both to empower workers to be able to join together and bargain, or it can be used to enhance what workers who are bargaining already have achieved. And so, especially with 6% of the private sector now collectively bargaining, a total of 11% of the entire economy has access to collective bargaining. I think we have to use every means necessary: government regulation, government legislation, executive action, direct corporate worker agreements as a way to catalyze millions more workers being able to join together in unions. Because when we have 30% of the workforce collectively bargaining, it will shape how dramatic those regulations can be on behalf of all working people.
Yeah, exactly. There's some great research, including by David Weil, on how unions really make policy and regulation work better. It's not like they're a supplement for each other, but they improve each other. So I think that's exactly right. So the next question is from Stephanie Bell. What approaches or mechanisms have you seen that successfully enable workers to participate in the design and implementation of workplace technologies? So for example, the person at the Stanford Technology Center, what are the underlying mechanisms that help those workers?
Well, I think there has to be a willingness on the part of the engineers that are designing the technology to consider listening to the frontline workers. And the human-centered institute that's been created at Stanford is actually engaging in a pilot with us to listen to home care providers as they consider the development of AI sensors in the homes of elderly. And it's a way for us to talk about the privacy concerns of elders and caregivers as that technology is being developed long before it hits the marketplace. So that's one example that happened, frankly, because of a relationship I forged on the Future of Work Commission. I think what we have to figure out on this question of mechanism is how does it not rely on happenstance, that I happen to meet the head of the Stanford Institute and we can co-create a way versus how do we if government investment is happening in research and technology, how does government investment require the dialogue with frontline workers as a condition of the government grants? And could philanthropy or corporate investors consider that every stakeholder has to be at the table? And can we use our bargaining power in the sectors of the economy we currently bargain in to impact how technology is introduced? You know, when we first started the Fight for 15 in a union, I remember one worker being threatened by a store manager, keep striking and we're going to put robots in your place. And the worker quite confidently said back to the manager, I'd love to be trained to do the code because I designed the best robot possible. You have no idea how I've figured out how to move differently than you trained me in order to get the job done. And to me, that's the frontier that we have to open, that workers do have a lot of intelligence and knowledge about especially routinized work that they would love to hand off to technology, as long as there's a path forward for those workers to realize their hopes and dreams that frankly had to get dashed because of poverty wage work that's never allowed them to pursue the education they want to the dreams they've had. And so I really see it as incredibly exciting about how to create a 21st century economy and unleash human potential. We just have to believe and create this mechanism that you're asking me about for workers to be a part of the design.
Yeah, well, I feel very hopeful about that, at least after hearing your remarks. So when you talked about sort of the routinization and how workers might be happy to have technology take on some of that, that is sort of not all the aspect of these types of jobs. So we have a question from Bruce Prechakowski from University of Michigan, Dearborn, where he asks that there's a tendency for developers of automation, AI, and new technologies to neglect the role that emotional labor plays in many service sector jobs. So how can you bargain in ways that promote the value of emotional labor and care work as essential skills that are not easily replaced by technology?
Yeah, that was what was written into the 6-month pilot that was part of the innovation grants that the Affordable Care Act encouraged. And those workers actually were in dialogue with primary care physicians, their consumers who were elders or people with disabilities, family members, and government to think about how the worry of watching the details on blood pressure, weight, skin color, if technology was going to hold that worry, it allowed the worker to actually focus on the emotional aspect of the support they provide their client. The thing that's so sad about this experiment, even though we proved we could save money, that technology is no longer available because it requires a decision by us as taxpayers and by government policymakers to have Medicaid funded at a rate that puts smartphones and tablets in the hands of 4 million caregivers today, soon to be 5 million by 2030, and then probably 10 million by 2040 or 2050. And it's going to require a reorientation in the value of this work and our willingness to invest.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And so for the last question, it's a question that's really near and dear to the work we do at Equitable Growth, from Alex Goldworth. How has or could academic research affect SEIU's work on technology?
I think the degree to which research could point the future and help make the case for the places in the country where engineering and workers are meeting and co-creating something, and it proves to be a higher value because of the front end co-design. I think that research would be incredibly helpful in making the case for why workers should have a seat at the table. I think the other part of the research would be to look at parts of the world where, because unions are bargaining across entire sectors, it escalates the introduction of technology that is fair and equitable. Like driverless trucks are being introduced nationally in Sweden because the trucks drivers union, the developers, the government all wanted to reduce carbon emissions, and they saw trucks as a big way to whack it. And now truck drivers are designing and teaching informing the AI driverless trucks and being used in middle schools to help young people imagine other kinds of jobs besides truck driving in their future. And so they've created a very systemic approach. So research that helps USers imagine the introduction of technology on scale that reduces one kind of work but opens up another kind of work, I think would be incredibly helpful in feeding the imagination that we're trying to drive at the bargaining table.
Great, thank you so much. That's great to hear. And thank you for taking the time to talk with us today. I really look forward to seeing all the continued work of Seiu in promoting the future for all workers, and also seeing the California Commission on Future of Works report come out soon. So thank you again. It was really great to hear your remarks.
Thank you.
And so next we'll be turning to our first panel, Technology for Worker Voice. Moderating this panel is Sam Harnett, who is a contributor for KQEW in San Francisco. His reporting covers labor, capital, technology, and Silicon Valley corporations. So I'm so excited to have him lead this discussion. Welcome, Sam.
Hello, thanks for having me. Yeah, so as Kate was saying, today we're going to be discussing technology and worker power. And as Mary was alluding to, this is really paradoxical because on one hand, technology has been used to oppress workers forever. You know, you just look at what's happening today with Uber. Uber is dominating their workers through an app. You look at what's happening in Amazon warehouses. They're being tracked. Every movement is being tracked by surveillance technology. And on the other hand, workers need to use technology in a sense because of our atomized digital world. Like if they want to talk to other workers, often the easiest or only way is through Facebook. And you see this with gig workers. They're often organizing through Facebook and other social media platforms. Or if you look at, say, Google, like the workers at Google were organizing through internal Google software. So workers are kind of caught in this paradox of being oppressed by technology, but needing it to organize. So the question is, how could they organize it effectively? And on the panel today, we have three lovely guests. First, we have Dawn Gearhart. She's the Gig Economy Organizing Director with the National Domestic Workers Alliance. Next, we have Meredith Whitaker. She's a research professor at NYU and the co-founder of the AI Now Institute. And finally, we have Steve Vaseli. He is a sociologist at the University of Pennsylvania. He's currently doing research on truckers and the trucking industry. Steve hopefully will be popping in momentarily. There's Steve. Great, and the discussion today is 45 minutes. You know, the four of us are going to chat for 30 minutes, and then we're going to have 15 minutes of Q&A. So feel free to pop questions into the chat. And the first thing I want to do to kick this off is Dawn, Meredith, and Steve. I'm going to ask you all three sort of rapid fire questions just to sort of frame the debate. I'm going to ask you just to describe what workers you're involved with. I want to ask you to describe the technology that oppresses them, like what's some tech stuff that's making their life hard, and then how, if they are using technology to sort of organize. And I want to start with you, Dawn. So yeah, tell us about your workers, tell us about the tech that's oppressing them, and tell us about how they're using tech to organize.
Sure. I'm really thankful that I had Mary Kay Henry to do the first portion of this intro because she talked a lot about home care workers, and at the National Domestic Workers Alliance, we are the voice for the 2.5 million domestic workers, which includes home care workers who are nannies, child care providers, the people who are making it possible for others to go to work. So domestic workers work individual homes, and increasingly they're using technology to find jobs and to be able to facilitate the work that they do, especially during this pandemic. And so there's several different ways technology is oppressing them, but I would just highlight the fact that access to domestic work jobs is severely limited if you're a non-English speaker, but we know that the vast majority of domestic workers are non-English speakers. So as technology continues to change and make it easier for people to place jobs and put out opportunities for work onto their platforms, it becomes harder and harder for domestic workers to actually access those jobs. And so that's one way where technology doesn't match up with the workforce and makes it hard for them to continue earning a living. And I'm looking forward to talking about more how we're using technology, but you gave the example of Facebook as the place where most gig workers are finding one another, and that's still true for us. We have some of our worker leaders who are moderating groups with over 10,000 other care providers. For example, one of our nanny groups has over 10,000 nannies in it, and the workers are not just doing their full-time job, but they're also trying to moderate these groups and use them as places for organizing. But as we know, and I think we'll hear about more, those workers are extremely exposed to surveillance and potential repercussions for trying to do that organizing work online on places and platforms like Facebook that are available to employers as well.
Great. All right, thanks for that little intro, Dawn. Meredith, same question. What are the workers that you're interacting with? How's technology making their life hard? And how, if they are they using technology to build solidarity?
Thank you for having me. I might rewind a bit. Before I was at NYU, I was at Google for a little over 13 years. I ran a research group there, and for the last 5 years of my career, I was one of the leaders of labor organizing in the company. So a lot of the workers that I still organize with or am in solidarity with are tech workers within the industry. And so there are manifold ways in which technology is used to harm and oppress, to surveil, to control, to assess, and otherwise to extract more labor and more profit at the expense of workers. And that's, throughout the industry, from gig workers who certainly should be considered tech workers, who are beholden to an opaque algorithm that is calibrated to extract as much profit irrespective of the pain, and that's built on the backs of years of regulatory arbitrage, to content moderators who are subjected to psychologically harmful conditions, sort of tending and cleaning the systems that we pretend are automated and magical, to Amazon warehouse workers and delivery drivers who are working for a kind of hellish Taylorism on steroids, where every move is timed and every action is penalized, and that's again set by an algorithm that, in the image of Taylor, is calibrated to run people to their limits and treat them more as property than as human beings. So across the board, we see technology ultimately being a tool of the powerful, used to extract, to subject, to assess, and to control subject populations, from workers to students to residents who may be subject to predictive policing. And I think we need to connect all of these systems and trace them back to the centers of technological power that are at this point sort of owning the means of technological production. And we need an analysis here that I think centers racial capitalism and recognizes those power dynamics before we can talk about technology as a fungible asset that either side can use or abuse.
Right. Something you brought up that I think is really interesting, I'd like to return to if we can in this conversation, is this idea that technology is neutral and that it can just be used for good or for ill. We need to have a real talk about what are we saying when we talk about technology and certain inherent technologies, who do they benefit and how? So that's something I definitely want to return to. But Steve, you're up. It's 3 questions. Who are the workers you're dealing with? What technologies have oppressed them, and what technologies have helped them grow solidarity?
So the workers that I focus on, or I have focused on for about 15 years, are long haul truck drivers, where the process of technology de-skilling the job, speeding it up, as Meredith was talking about with this Taylorist kind of approach, that's long standing there. My current work is in last mile delivery, where we're seeing a similar process with Amazon and others sort of figuring out how to algorithmically manage workers. And the theme I think that is most interesting across those 2 parts of my work is really the de-skilling, right? So it's the speeding up of the work, but it's also gathering lots of information through surveillance and communications technologies that allow the company to use less skilled workers in the future. And I think that's the stage that last mile delivery is at, where we have a lot of good jobs still with UPS and US Postal Service and others. And there's a real concerted effort by Amazon in particular, right, to sort of take the brains of those workers and figure out why they're so efficient and figure out how to do it with less skilled workers. All that knowledge that delivery driver has of where to park and when the schools get out and where you like your package left and all these things that matter for speed and efficiency and customer service, that currently has creates a good job for a UPS driver or a US postal worker, right? Amazon's trying to figure out how do we do that with a minimum wage worker. And so that's the sort of big trend in the technology in that space. The most interesting thing that's happening in terms of worker voice and organizing is definitely happening around Facebook and other social media, where workers who were previously disconnected across different segments of these very large organizations, whether it's UPS or US Postal or Amazon, are communicating about sort of what's happening here. And the most interesting example of that, just to give one, was, when the US Postal Service started to make changes before the mail-in vote, right? And we got this, information out, came up through the union, but workers were really talking about, what is the Postmaster General doing in your location? What machines have they removed? How have you responded? And they were communicating in lots of ways about all of the different changes that they were seeing, weeks ahead of when, it became public that, oh my God, like they're sabotaging the mail system. Postal workers were talking across, post office, trying to gather information of how widespread is this? Where is it happening? Why do you think it's happening? And those conversations were really important.
So it seems like we've touched on this idea of workers communicating through Facebook, but maybe that's the next place to go, because you think, okay, Facebook is a private corporation, like great, now they're collecting all these data on the workers, like exchanging messages and their communications. So yeah, I wanted to open that up. Like, what's the danger of the fact that workers end up on these platforms that are owned by private third parties? And again, Dawn, I'm thinking about gig workers with Facebook. I've interviewed a lot of Uber drivers who organize through that. But Meredith, I'm also thinking about, like, at Google, I've heard that a lot of folks were on internal Google communication tools to organize. So Dawn, yeah, maybe first, if you want to chime in on sort of the dangers you see with that, or maybe the bind you feel like workers are in, and also maybe, is it hard to shift them off to something else? Like, okay, you're using Facebook to collaborate, but can you get the workers to, like, kind of collaborate on it? I think you're muted, Dawn. Yeah, great.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yep.
So before starting at NDWA, I spent 6 years organizing taxi, Uber, and Lyft drivers. And at first, Facebook was a great place for us to be able to find each other and have community and have conversations. But it was really, really a very short amount of time before those groups were infiltrated by people from the company or people who were paid by the company to be there to basically spy and also to change the conversation and shift the narrative. And I think at NDWA, we had a kind of a different problem, which is that domestic workers are all working in individual homes. Many of them are undocumented. Many of them speak English as a second or third language. And we just wanted to be able to find them. So unlike being able to find drivers, and then we were already having those conversations, for us at NDWA, it was really about trying to identify those workers. And we actually went the route of creating a bot where we were able to get in contact with over 230,000 individual domestic workers who had never been aggregated or contacted before. And since the beginning of the pandemic, we have done weekly surveys with those workers. And so we have an incredibly rich and unique data set from domestic workers on the ground that's updated every week about what they're experiencing. But there was also a shift in the way Facebook was operating, and we had to become a news organization instead of an organization that was running this bot to be able to try to interact with people. Now we have to push articles and try to get a certain number of people to open them and keep them relevant. So we are incredibly beholden to Facebook's infrastructure to even be able to stay in contact with this huge number of people that we identified, that we have cultivated, that we've developed as leaders. I think, we were able to send out money to directly support these domestic workers to over 10,000 of them through that same bot. But at any moment, that access could be taken away by the company. So unlike the case with Uber and Lyft, where it was actually the company doing the surveillance and infiltrating the group, now we're completely reliant on a company like Facebook to be able to even interact with these people. And it's not like we find them other places. It's not like if we hang out at their workplace, we can meet them, or at the airport parking lot, we'll be able to run into them. Like, they are working in houses and hustling to try to survive. and their only way of connection with us and our only lifeline to them is this platform. And I think we're not the first people to call out Facebook and try to hold them to account, but I think it's just the context is that technological advances are concentrating more and more power into a few corporations, which then weakens the working conditions and allows those companies to have disproportionate control over workers. And that's also true when we try to use platforms like Facebook to do organizing. Like there's a disproportionate amount of reliance and control by the company, and at any point our access could be taken away. So it's really exciting to us that we have this ability to talk to these new groups of people, but we don't know how long that will last. And so when we're thinking like, what is a threat for us, that's at the top of the list.
I mean, as someone who works in media where a tweak on the Facebook algorithm means suddenly no one's going to the stories anymore. And yet Facebook's like, we're neutral and we're just a platform and we don't know what you're talking about. So I hear you on that. Meredith, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I everything Dawn said, right? And I think, again, we need to recognize the significant concentrations of power that are often masquerading as technological innovation and advancement when really it's sort of marketing about the expansive power these tech companies have. You know, at Google, like I would say, you dig where you stand, right? Like old IWW slogan. And we have these platforms. They have eclipsed a lot of our public spaces, a lot of our other communications mechanisms, and that's that. And at Google, we certainly, you know, I would say we disseminated information and made folks aware about organizing through internal platforms, but then we use Signal. Right. And you always, like, as fast as you can, if you want to talk strategy, if you want to talk tactics, move on to Signal, which is an encrypted messaging app that doesn't keep any of this information. And it has features that allows you to sort of disappear messages and will not be subject to the sort of political economy of surveillance capitalism that is the lifeblood of these other corporations. And I think that, you know, that you're always going to be sort of in an uneasy negotiation there, because you need to reach people and you need to, especially for the sort of political education component of this, that I think really needs to be emphasized with tech, because a lot of these are the confluence of fairly unfamiliar concepts like labor militancy and technological control, right? You know, reach people through these platforms, but then, you know, take the organizing to Signal or, you know, other modes if you can. And I want to connect this back to the idea of a seat at the table, which is an uneasy concept for me, frankly, because I think, you know, ideally we would demand that workers run the table, because I see the table right now being set by corporations who have more power than nation states. And, you know, I don't know how you negotiate without symmetric power and how you negotiate with companies with this much power and control. So I think, you know, I'm looking to sort of more militant labor strategies. How do you flex, you know, the strike? How do you actually threaten these corporations whose nodes of power are so expansive and, you know, who are not known to negotiate in good faith? And I will, you know, I say that as someone with over a decade of experience in that realm. They're always going to have more power in this dynamic unless there are sort of other modes of power we can marshal. And I would look to, you know, Google's actions in Australia for kind of an example of how that type of brinksmanship goes with these companies.
I mean, two things that you said that I think to hit home, like the idea of technology is power. Like often you know, I am technically a tech reporter, but I always say like I'm not reporting on technology. Like what technology am I reporting on? There's no chips, there's no coding languages. Like this is a company with an app, you know, or that, you know, in terms of Facebook, it's like this is just a media company who's amassed a bunch of users. And so often I feel like technology gets bandied around as a term, but really what you're talking about is power accumulation. Same with Uber. I mean, they made an app and they use smartphones, which were invented over a decade ago by a different company. And they use GPS, which was invented 4 or 5 decades ago, mostly by the US military. So, you know, those things, I think it's very important to keep that terminology straight. Yeah, Steve, actually, on that point, I was thinking of a story that you were telling me about UPS drivers sort of trying to beat the machine. And again, I'm, you know, UPS drivers getting these pre-planned routes, like these algorithmic routes, and being like, okay, like, you're telling me how to do this through the algorithm, but I can do it faster. Yeah, I wonder if you just sort of tell that anecdote, because I thought that was a kind of interesting way to understand how technology does kind of oppress, but then also you feed into it by fighting against it.
Yeah, so you can have these unintended consequences that you don't know you don't really understand, right, until time marches on, unfortunately. So in this case, there's this need to de-skill these workers, right, to figure out what makes them so efficient. And so UPS created a system called Orion that in many ways looks like what Amazon Flex, the dispatching system, looks like, which is the same system that dispatches Amazon's franchise drivers. And the idea is that you take the order of the packages and you put it into a mapping program and you tell the driver what the most efficient way to run it is. Well, of course, these UPS drivers know far better than this system what's going to happen on that route and how to run it most effectively and efficiently. And so what's happened is they get this route in the morning from Orion that says your route should take you 8.5 hours and you should travel 122 miles. And the workers are saying, well, I can beat that, and so it ends up kind of speeding them up because they see it as a kind of challenge, right? And rightfully so. They're they have lots of skills and information, and they take offense that to the idea that you
pride in their job. A kind of professional. Right?
Absolutely. Like when you talk to a UPS driver, it is my route. Like that's the first, when they say my route, they mean it. They have customers on it. They have relationships on it. They can run it better than anybody else. And you challenge them with that computer, with that Taylorization, and actually they end up speeding up, right? So UPS may, get their benefit from that, right? Because the workers are reacting to it.
Right, and then although of course though that data is fed into the algorithm and the algorithm gets smarter, right? So.
And I think that's the challenge.
Yeah, Don, I wonder. Sorry, what did you say, Steve?
But yes, I think that is the challenge moving forward, right? As these right now they're terrible, right? Machine learning's not good. The artificial intelligence, planning the stuff, it's just not that good. But if you can get a dozen more variables taken into account, and if the drivers are being tracked and the data is being collected, right? Eventually, we're going to start to see these things get faster and get better to the point where you can use cheaper labor.
Dawn, did you want to jump in? I have a question for you, or you could comment if there was something you wanted to
Go ahead.
Chime in on. Yeah, I was just thinking, talking about the gig economy and thinking about these apps. Again, this is another question about technology as control. But I guess I think like you get this top-down app where suddenly a company like Instacart says, okay, we got an app, and you have all these isolated, atomized workers on that app. Like, are you seeing workers go the other way of trying to be like, okay, let's have a collective and build our own app, to offer services like cleaning or delivery? And if not, they're not like, have you run into really challenges like that? Like, I know antitrust is a big problem. Like with Uber, if a bunch of drivers said, hey, we want to have an app and fix prices, they'd be sued out of existence by antitrust. But venture capitalists can come in and say, hey, we have an app, and we can set the prices, and antitrust is like, yeah, okay.
Yeah, there's a lot of challenges, and I've seen it happen for drivers and also for domestic workers. And for domestic workers in particular, there's a difference in the way that they relate to their customers because they're caring for the most vulnerable people in our societies. And they're expected to be in individual homes with people. And so they're super vulnerable for working in individual workspaces, but they need to have a base level of trust that doesn't have to exist when you're just ordering something and having it arrive at your house. Like you expect the package to get to your door, but it's not the same thing as entrusting someone with your child for the day in the way that it is for domestic workers. And then there's also the problem that we have with scaling, which is true across these platforms, but is especially true for domestic workers. When families and employers are looking to hire people to come into their home, they're not looking at small boutique places to do that or willing to download new platforms to do that. We have seen individual co-ops come up for cleaning, especially, but it's very, very limited when it comes to childcare, and it's just very hard to compete. The examples, companies like Handy pre-pandemic were dispatching 100,000 cleaning jobs in a month. And Care.com has almost 40 million people on its platform between caregivers and employers. And so trying to match that scale so that you can offer the richness of potential jobs as well as workers to consumers is just really, really difficult to do. And I don't think, even in situations where we could create apps, and we've really explored that, it's not very difficult to actually build the app. The hard part is the acquisition of getting people to continue to use it, both consumers and workers. And so we are committed to the idea that there needs to be frameworks when it comes to policy around allowing cooperatives to work, especially for domestic workers, but it's just extremely difficult to get to that point given the fact that they're going to be entrusted with your grandmother or your child, and people's willingness to adopt a new platform to do that. They're kind of reliant on these platforms to do the screening. Whether that actually happens is its own story, and there's been lots of reporting about that.
Right.
But that's the expectation of consumers. And so it makes it difficult to start up a new platform like that and acquire enough workers and users. But we're really, really interested in decreasing the monopsony power where a few companies are holding the access to all of the jobs for the domestic
And yeah,
workforce
something you
and
said,
for other
Dawn,
gig workers.
Oh, so something you said that really stuck with me is building the app's not hard, which again gets this technology argument. You know, like it's not building the app; it's having the power and money to acquire users, having a brand. You know, it's the fact that antitrust law is stacked against workers and is pro corporations. It's all of those problems. Which I want to transition to the last part is to sort of talk about like, is it even right to be talking about technology? Should we be talking about power and policy? But Meredith, I saw you wanted to jump in, so. Go for it.
Like hands down again emphasize what Dawn said. And I worked in the infrastructure group at Google for a long time, and it's extremely expensive to scale these apps beyond a handful of users. You start having to pay transit costs and you start having to pay infrastructure costs. That infrastructure is almost entirely owned by Google, Amazon, or Microsoft. Those are the people who control the cloud. No one runs their own data center. And if you did, it would be extraordinarily expensive. Then you have to hire developers to maintain it across a number of platforms. So Android, iOS, etc. And if you're trying to target folks who don't have the latest version of the operating system, then you're dividing those platforms in a number of ways. So the maintenance cost and the expense there, you're looking at tens of millions of dollars a month minimum. And if you're trying to scale it beyond that, you're looking at much more than that. And those are hidden costs that I think have been hidden below a narrative of, again, scientific innovation and technological progress, where, two men in a garage just had an idea and poof, we're all surveilled by Google. That's never been the case. The main expense at all of these companies is infrastructural, which again gets back to, what are we talking about when we're talking about tech for good and sort of doing it on our own? Because we're never, in the conditions we're in now, we're never going to have that power. So the fight has to be for that power before we decide what we would do with the tech, if we would use it like this at all.
I mean, again, just to connect back to something we were talking about earlier, if there were a public encrypted Facebook type infrastructure for workers to talk on, that would be a great alternative to a one controlled by a corporation, but it doesn't exist. And the same could be said about a lot of public infrastructure, which a lot of those, two white guys that started their startups were using public infrastructure to build their monopolies. It's important to remember. Yeah, Steve, I wanted to circle back to you and thinking about truckers who have been isolated and atomized and deunionized by regulations. Do you feel like a lot of, like you said, the workers are talking around Facebook now, but do you feel like there's a lot of just sort of policy and regulatory barriers that have been put up? Again, I'm thinking of stuff like antitrust, things like that.
Yeah, and I think this gets, to the part of the question around the context in which this technological development is happening, right? It's just, there's so little voice for workers in segments of this industry. I mean, really zero voice. And so the problems that exist in these labor markets, right, that are shaping power there are just, some of it's just basic enforcement. We have, widespread misclassification. We have, lots of workers who don't even get minimum wage. They have no recourse to, fight these things, let alone to engage in these policy debates. And, we're dealing with one issue right now that everybody I'm sure has heard a lot about, which is self-driving trucks. Self-driving trucks are coming about now, and we may see them out in the next few years. I mean, there was 15 years of government-sponsored R&D that created the foundation of this technology, right? That then Google and a few others have, stepped into, and when they saw commercial potential. And now we're having these debates about sort of autonomous technology and what the Department of Transportation and others should do about them. And we're still relying entirely on what the tech companies say can happen, right? We're letting them envision the future for us rather than saying, Okay, great. You've invented a truck that can drive itself. How is it going to, clean urban air for vulnerable communities? How is it going to make trucking jobs better? How is it going to reduce congestion, make cities more livable, and increase equity, right? And that is just, we're not having those conversations at all around technology because we don't have that seat at the table.
Right, we're going to move to the question answer portion. But yeah, Steve, I just want to follow up. I think about this, like I did this whole series on sort of shareholder capitalism. And it just seems like if the final goal is always to increase money for investors, like, okay, we can make a drone to look at the trees, or we can make a self-driving car, or we can make a little Roomba that cleans the rooms better for people doing housework. But if the company just wants to make more money, then obviously they're just going to cut labor costs. Like, so if you don't solve, that, with workers on boards or workers, reorienting the conversation around them instead of shareholders, maybe you could have some of those changes. Anyway, I want to return to questions. Feel free to jump in on any of these questions. The first is a question from Samantha. She says, are company communication platforms integral to worker organizing efforts? In light of a fissured distributed workforce? I think she's talking about the fact that modern workforces are really fissured. Like you have Uber, which is a company where most of the work is done by people who are been misclassified, frankly, as independent contractors, and they're not on the same internal communication platforms as Uber engineers, right? Again, you think about Google, again, this massive fractured, fissured workplace. Does that make organizing really hard? Not just like for logistics reasons, but because they can't use the same internal communication platforms. Nodding heads. I think we agree. Yes, it makes it hard. She actually asked about a specific NLRB ruling, Caesars Entertainment. Are any of you familiar with Caesars Entertainment NLRB ruling? I am not intimately familiar with that. But that apparently limited employee use of computer-owned IT infrastructure for Section 7 protected activities. Do you have any? No, I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Yeah, making it harder. Barbara, she's a PhD candidate at Free University Berlin. She has a question for you, Dawn, specifically. She was wondering if you could elaborate on the bot that you used to get in touch with domestic workers, and what are you hoping to do with the data you collected in the surveys that you mentioned?
Yeah, so we've started to compile the data. There's other organizations that do bots, and we're part of like a bot cohort where other organizations are doing things like they're able to reach 40% of all Black voters, African-American voters between 15 and 25, or like between 15 and 35. So it's very extreme what people have been able to do previously with bots. It's 100% reliant on Facebook. So that's a huge risk for us, as I mentioned earlier. And so far with our data set, we used it in the first outset when we decided that we were going to pivot to actually deliver benefits during the pandemic in the form of like direct cash assistance to domestic workers. We used the bot to do that, and it was our most effective channel to find domestic workers and get them signed up for this assistance and actually deliver it and confirm its delivery. So we know that over 10,000 individual domestic workers received money directly from us during this pandemic when they weren't working. We're hoping to be able to use all of that data to inform policy, and we're running a federal domestic workers bill of rights, which now we have all of this data to support to say, we knew first, for example, that women were going to be most impacted or were being most impacted by the pandemic. Most women were losing their jobs. People were at 0% income much earlier on than it was being reported. So we have kind of an advanced window into what's happening and what the impacts are, including all the federal programs that went into place or did not go into place. So I'm more than happy to talk more about the bot separately. If anybody wants to reach out, I'd be very happy to respond and can connect you to our bot team. But we want to be able to inform policymakers about what domestic workers and women of color are facing more broadly.
And Dawn, you bring up a really important point of who has the data, who controls the data. As a reporter who's been covering Uber and Lyft for years, like I don't know, they don't release lots of data. We don't really know. And a lot of drivers don't know. I mean, drivers constantly come to me and they say, I think that they're messing with the algorithm. I think they're changing stuff. I can't, and there's no real way from the outside to prove what's going on. I'm actually doing a story about workers who are trying to get an app to keep track of things themselves. But again, then this is another app that workers then have to use on top of the other app that they use, which is just like, again, more burden. It's like, and you also have to clean your car because we're in a pandemic and do all this other labor. But anyway, Dawn, you bring up a really important point that without data, it's really hard to convince policymakers, to change policies. Anybody else want to jump in?
Sam, I do. So I think on this data question, at least in transportation, and maybe they're analogous levers in other industries, but in transportation, we provide the workplace, right? We fund it, we build it, we all use it. We're all concerned about, the efficiency of it, the safety of it, the quality of the jobs, the emissions from it, whether it's Uber, Lyft, trucks, et cetera. We're underplaying our hand when it comes to this data. If you want to use public roadways, if you want to come into cities, if you want to drive on the interstate, we want to see that data. We want to use that data to help manage the system better. I don't think that that's too much to ask, and it seems to me like it's a really good starting point. But I think we have to get bolder about putting our thumb on the scale for other stakeholders, other than just making shipping faster. Everybody loves to get their stuff to today. We'd like to get it in an hour, sure, but at what cost? And we need to start to balance those policy goals. And data's at the heart of that, and these companies are producing it, and we should be requiring that we have access to it.
And Steve, Meredith, you want to chime in?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And part of my background's in large scale infrastructural measurement, right? So I think we need data, but we also need to ensure that the workers have access to the data and to the algorithmic parameters. Like, frankly, I think the workers should have control over those systems and the ability to shape them, because it's very easy to lie with data, and you can sort of shift the variable or shift the methodology. And if you're not able to validate the data that is sent to lawmakers against the lived experience of workers, then what you have is just sort of another layer in an asymmetric power relationship. And I'd look to sort of, all of these companies' transparency reports and their diversity reports, right, which speak a much different story through sort of fudged data than the lives of the workers at these companies. So I think really, I would point to the Polish Amazon warehouse workers who are struck and have been bargaining now for control over the rate algorithm and the data that was feeding it as a kind of example there, because I would not trust these companies, given their track record, to sort of produce data that is actually speaking to these realities. And then you begin to funnel your fight into sort of fudging numbers instead of over kind of control of the systems and your lives and your workplaces.
I mean, I can't tell you how many times PR folks for gig companies have said, no, we have some data. We gave it to these economists and they did that report. And I was like, okay, you gave some economists some data. Like, what? Okay. Like, I don't know anything about that. I mean, it's really hard, And they're like, what, do you want us to like just show you everything? And I was like, yeah, that would be great. Let's do that. And Steve, I just want to follow up on another thing you said, that like, so much of the conversation, when you involve especially economists, comes down to things about efficiency. And so many policymakers also go to efficiency. It's like, well, it's more efficient. Uber showing that they have the scale, they can do all these things. And so then I feel like that, in my experience, has often become the barrier for asking for that data. It's like, well, we could be pushy, but actually, this seems like it's working really efficiently. And we're basically stuck in these sort of this terminology that is all based around what can get the consumer something for a penny less, or what can get the consumer something 5 minutes faster. Of course, not talking about like what's happening to the environment, what's happening to the community, what's happening to that worker who can't make a living wage. Like those metrics are just like out the window. So yeah, I do. Again, we don't have time, but just you could refocus the whole conversation about like what are the actual metrics we're talking about when we're discussing, where workers are vis-a-vis capital. All right, so I want to return to another question. This is from Claire. She's a PhD candidate at the University of Pennsylvania. She says, how does the use of tech, with quotation marks, which I like, as separated from actual R&D, obscure the labor issues that affect workers in tech firms and how these firms make money? I'm interested, especially in how organizers are communicating about these issues to both workers and public who are not currently plugged into these debates and organizing efforts. And I'm not 100% sure, but I think Claire left this opening with saying, you know, the tech in quotation marks versus the actual R&D towards their business model, which, let's take Uber. Their tech is an app, but what's their R&D in terms of their main business model? So yeah, again, I guess, again, has that obscure labor issues? Like, how does this basically, our focus on what the quote unquote tech is that's being presented to us as opposed to the R&D that's actually happening, or business model obscure what labor issues the actual workers are encountering? Claire, I hope that was an accurate summation of your question. But
I mean, I hope this is answering the question, because I think it's important to emphasize that these companies, you know, this is technology that is produced by private firms. And even when there's technology produced sort of in the public domain or the public interest, it's still reliant on the infrastructure and tooling of these firms. So like, again, we always got to keep reframing it that way. And they have owned the narrative around tech for about 20 years. They've told us what it is and what it isn't. They have, you know, affirmed, as Dina Dubal and folks like the Gig Workers Collective have highlighted, that, you know, Uber is a flexible platform for entrepreneurs using magical tech, when it's a, you know, it's a regulatory arbitrage scheme that, you know, displaced apps that taxi drivers were building for themselves, right? So I think one of the things that is characteristic of these firms is, like, all of this is hidden behind corporate secrecy, right? And you don't get access to, you know, what the tech actually is, and you don't get access to where it is actually used in many cases. Because a lot of these technologies, if we're talking about the sort of Googles and Amazons, they sort of sell these technologies to many different markets. If we're talking about Uber, sort of it's deployed in many different places. But, you know, we look to these companies as experts on technology, and not to the people whose lived experience as subjects under these technologies can actually inform what is happening and what it does. And one more point there, I think, you know, I've heard a lot about like developers sitting down with workers. I think that's, you know, that's like lovely. And Amazon delivery driver organizer Adrian Williams made a similar call recently, like, you know, let's design our routes together because these are ridiculous. However, like, the developers don't usually have as much power as you might say, right? Like, if these goals are set by executives or set by sales teams, oftentimes the contracts between a company and a third party who's licensing technology themselves are secret. The developers who are developing it have no idea where that technology is going. And there was, you know, I was organizing at Google around weapons contracts and you know, artificial intelligence for, you know, drone targeting that was being built by many people who didn't know what they were contributing to, right? So again, we got to look back to,
right,
you know, the way in which scientific management techniques and other sort of compartmentalization in these firms make it really hard to just, you know, find that one person to talk to, because, you know, they're ultimately the objective function, the goal of these companies is always infinite growth and infinite revenue, this sort of, you know, deadly capitalist fever dream that we're now
right,
living in the detritus of.
the capitalist fever dream. Yes, I mean, I just learned yesterday that private investment has eclipsed public investment. And I just think this is an interesting point since we're talking about transparency. Like, we don't, for so long, we haven't really known what's going on inside these companies, what the plans are. They haven't been subject to the SEC kind of regulations that a public company would have been subject to. And these companies like Uber waited a long time to have their IPO, and they spent a long time operating without disclosing, you know, their financials or how they're making money or who they're putting on their board and why, in a way that they would have been scrutinized in the public system. And I just think it's interesting when you get to that, like, how are you making money? And I doubt a public company could have come and said, we're going to have autonomous cars in a couple of years, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do that. And people will be looking at their financials being like, that doesn't make any sense. So that whole idea of that private kind of shield that gets you from scrutiny, I think is a big part of the conversation. Dawn, did you want to jump in?
I just wanted to agree. And I think that it's been a long time that those of us who've been paying attention to this have been saying the same things. Like, I remember, you know, it maybe 5-6 years ago, talking to Uber drivers who had proof and documentation about how they're making less than $3 an hour at the same time as studies were coming out about drivers making $70,000 an hour, and the company coming forward, you know, to elected officials with their data to show how people are really making more than a living wage and that this is a great source of income for people. And I think that was like the first point in the narrative where it became clear that it wasn't just going to be like, theoretically that they would be using their own data to weaponize it against us in the public arena when it came down to actually legislating, but that it was going to be like on the ground warfare. And I think Meredith did the best job of describing that, of like what it really feels like, to understand that you're trying to operate and trying to explain in a narrative that's been controlled for the past 20 years by these companies who hold everything as close as possible to their chest and will sue anybody who tries to pursue it using legislation or government. So it's just a very asymmetrical field to try to fight in, even when you have people who say, I spend 14 hours a day on this platform and here's what I experience every day. It's not taken as seriously.
Right. Well, we have to wrap up. I just want to actually read John Marshall's question because it's more of just a comment. He says, this discussion about the cost of achieving scale on platforms and also providing consumers with assurances regarding safety for services provided really suggests that there's a role for the government to create public platforms that would enjoy the scale and network effects necessary to meet everyone's needs. He asked, what steps can we take to make that happen? But we're going to save that for a future panel. And then Natalie, just jumping, again, this is something to sort of leave us with another thought. Jumping on something Steve said, you know, people want everything quickly, but at what cost? How do you change the culture in this country from a focus on the individual and more to a focus on what benefits society in general? If we had that answer, we would all be in much better shape, I feel. So with that, I'll leave it back to you, Kate.
Great. Thank you so much, Sam. And I mean, the answer to Natalie's question is like so much of what we generally try to do at Equitable Growth is change the broader narratives to make that long-term change. But I want to thank everyone on our first panel for a great discussion on how technology is used for worker voice, and extra big thanks to Sam Harnett for moderating. That was really exceptional moderation, so I really appreciate everyone taking the time. So now we will turn to our second panel, which is on bargaining over technology. Moderating this panel is Sarah Jaffe, who is a Type Media Fellow and an independent journalist who writes on the politics of power from workplaces to social movements. Her new book that just came out a few weeks ago is titled Work Won't Love You Back: How Devotion to Our Jobs Keeps Us Exploited, Exhausted, and Alone. And it is really exceptional, so I recommend that everyone go get Sarah's book when they get a chance. And I want to welcome Sarah to our next panel.
All right. Hello, am I actually on screen yet? I'm viewing somebody else's screen. I don't know if you can see me or hear me. Somebody let me know if you can.
One second. I think it was the transition slide. There we go.
Hello, now I'm on screen. So many Zoom calls. Hi, I'm Sarah. Thank you all for having me here today. It's going to be a really exciting conversation. I have a list of panelists with very long bios, and in the interest of time not being that much, I might abridge these just a little bit because all of you are incredibly impressive people and it will take me forever to read this, and I want to hear from you instead. So first off, we have Abdel Rahman M. Muse is the executive director of the Awood Center, a place for the East African community to learn, defend our rights at work, and build East African worker power. Previously, he worked in the office of Mayor Betsy Hodges of Minneapolis, and on housing, labor, neighborhoods, and East African Muslim communities. And you have probably heard of them because they did some impressive organizing against Amazon. Next, I have Grisham Rogers, who is an associate professor of law at Temple University Beasley School of Law, where he teaches labor law, employment discrimination, and torts. And his current research explores the relationship among labor and employment law, workplace technological development, and economic and social equality. And he's writing a book on those questions. Then I have, not quite on screen yet because I'm going too fast. Looks like I've got everybody now, right? No, okay. I have William Spriggs here now, who's a professor in and former chair of the Department of Economics at Howard University and chief economist at the AFL-CIO. In his role at the AFL-CIO, he chairs the Economic Policy Working Group for the Trade Union Advisory Committee to the OECD and serves on the board of the National Bureau of Economic Research. And finally, Julia Tacona, who is a sociologist who researches technologies of work, emotions, and inequality. With a passion for qualitative methods, her dissertation, Left to Our Own Devices, Coping with Insecure Work in a Digital Age, examines the ways that workers use personal devices to navigate flexible job markets and economic insecurity and deal with the fallout of these conditions in their intimate lives. And I want to read that. So again, we have so little time, and my experience with all of these is that we're going to go so quickly. So in the interest of time, I'm going to call on people when I ask a question, just so we don't do that thing where we sit there staring at the screen and going, who's going to talk? I'm going to make everybody go first a different time. So we want to start off with a question that's sort of broad and for everyone, but maybe I think everyone can speak to a little different aspect of this as it fits with your work. So the question is, how and where are we seeing digital and mobile technologies integrated into the labor process? And what has this meant for workplace control and labor exploitation in the different areas that you're seeing that? And I'm going to ask Abdi to go first, if you don't mind.
Thank you. My name is Abdi. I work mostly with East African workers who work at Amazon. The way our workers interact with technology is through rate and surveillance. We feel that Amazon really surveills every step of the way, and this means for them really increased workload. Sometimes mostly inhumane workload that leads to increased injuries, insecurity. It's sometimes really they feel that they are competing with robots, and the expectation is really to be a human robots at Amazon, and that's really means cycling in and out so many workers. And in Minnesota, where we have one of the worst economic disparity between whites and people of color, we see the richest company in the world coming to the community and again exploits the most vulnerable community in the state. And instead of really bringing safe and good and reliable jobs, it really creates, it limits inequality by providing very unsafe jobs at the workspace, and also oppressing workers' voice. And currently, they are also, utilizing COVID-19 to further monitor and surveil workers and to oppress workers' voice, because workers have been demanding, safe workplace, and that's how Amazon is really utilizing technology to extremely exploit workers, but also to silence them when they demand dignity and the safety at the workplace. And I want to note that most of the workers that we work with are new to this country, and it takes a lot of bravery to really stand up to the richest company in the world when you are relatively new to the country.
Yeah, absolutely. Grisham, can I call on you?
Sure, and thank you so much for having me here. A couple of things. The book that I've been writing is called Data and Democracy at Work. It's now under review at MIT, and the question you asked actually leads right into part of the core argument of the book. What I try to do is trace out the use of data-driven technology to erode workers' associational power, by which I mean really their ability to take concerted action and protect themselves in ways that unions have always done, but also in ways that workers have done, short of unionizing, simply developing collective norms and taking action to stand up for themselves in the workplace and in the political sphere. We're seeing similar developments, I think, across all of the large firms in the low-wage economy right now, in retail, in logistics, in hotels, in food service, especially fast food. Basically, in each of those sectors, companies are under pressure from finance to keep profits high, but it's also challenging to increase productivity year over year because these are service sectors. And so what they're doing is gathering as much data as possible, using it in part to develop new products, but then also just to suppress wages in large part by suppressing associational power. just one more thing I'll say and then pass it on to others. I think you can break this into 3 categories, which is helpful to think about the ways it's playing out at companies like Amazon, Walmart, McDonald's, Uber, Marriott, et cetera. First category is surveilling workers much more closely, both to extract some of their knowledge and replicate it, but then also just to force them to work more rapidly and to prevent them from unionizing by seeing when they are starting to talk about unionizing or starting to take collective action. The second is to reorganize production in ways that are, the prior panel mentioned, familiar from Taylorism. Separate workers from each other, de-skill the work, have workers kind of laboring alone, even if they're together in large groups, and reform the jobs so that workers can be plugged in and out very quickly. That makes it harder for them to organize and harder for them to claim, wages on the basis of skills. And then finally, and this is, characteristic, and there's been a lot of attention to it, but I think we need even more, developing massive scale at the same time that you're fissuring workers away from the core company. So again, you see this at McDonald's, at Amazon, at Walmart. All of those companies are massive and they dominate in their sectors. And yet, with a sort of partial exception of Walmart, managed to avoid legal duties toward employees. And technology is intimately connected with that because it enables companies to keep an eye on what workers are doing, even if they're many, many miles away from headquarters. So all of this is facilitated and encouraged by our labor law. And the net effect of it is that workers have to compete with one another for jobs, whereas companies, are able to claim IP rents and monopoly rents and maintain profits at quite a high rate.
Yeah, I find that fascinating, the way that the surveillance enables the fissuring workplace. William, can I go to you next?
Well, I think one of the areas is the change in how firms recruit workers.
Mm-hmm.
So rare is it today that if you send in a resume, you have anyone to respond to. There's not an email you can send it a note. Hey, you got my resume. What's up? There definitely is no phone number, and there's never a person. And this is allowed for the generation of algorithms to weed out applications. So even though we've improved technology so that workers can search more efficiently, they can send out many resumes, it's not clear how productive that new capacity by workers is, because it goes into a box. And what comes out is harder for us to trace. So whether we want to enforce equal employment opportunity, whether we want to enforce any of the many incentives that we have written into code, preferences for hiring veterans, making sure that jobs are accessible for people who have handicaps, all of these things get thrown out the window because we've turned our labor market into this black box. It would be one thing were it only for programmer jobs, but it's now taken over. This is the way in which most workers have to be recruited. This could be an engine for greater objectivity, but we don't know what's in the black box. A disturbing thing is that economists continue to do studies, name studies, the ones everybody's familiar with, where they choose names that look African American. And you still see this response rate, and you have to wonder, did a human do that? Or are there now algorithms that pick up names? And remember, in these studies, the only thing different is the name. So it is becoming frightening that we have labor markets that we don't understand. And we've just ceded so much to corporations when it comes to the control of information. And that's just one of those where we don't know where it's going, or to be honest, where it is.
Absolutely. Julia, I also saw you nodding a lot to that, which I was also doing.
Yeah, absolutely, Bill. That was, you said a lot of some of the things that I wanted to say. So thank you very much for setting that up so nicely. Yeah. So the workers that I study don't have workplaces, right? Like a lot of the folks who I have been talking to, since 2013, 2014 about the technology that they rely on to keep their jobs are folks who are gig workers before the term was cool, like before the term was associated with technology so strongly. They're folks who are, having multiple part-time jobs in retail, or they're stringing together work in the formal and informal economy. And a lot of the places where they, hit these technological barriers, where they really feel these technologies discriminating against them, is in thinking about hiring and in these kinds of risk assessment technologies that we're seeing. And I should say this is coming from research that I've been working on for a few years with a collaborator at the Data and Society Research Institute, Alexander Matisco, where we've been looking at the ways that domestic workers, care workers, and domestic cleaners have been using platforms like care.com, Handy, and many others. Dawn Gearhart was on the previous panel, who's also very well versed in these. And we're seeing, these technologies are not necessarily mediating the labor process as much as we would think, like we usually understand that term as like task completion, right? They're not telling domestic cleaners like, oh, clean the kitchen now, or now it's time to vacuum the floor, right? Like in the way that it controls Uber drivers' work or an Amazon warehouse workers' work. But nevertheless, it is having these really important effects on our ideas about who to trust and who's trustworthy, who's risky, which workers achieve the amount of visibility that you need to achieve in order to even be matched or to be visible on these platforms. And so in my research, one of the things that, I find that I'm pushing a lot is saying we need to actually rethink what parts of the labor process we're looking at here, because a lot of what I'm seeing with precarious and insecure work is that we're seeing stuff at the very, very, very beginning of the labor process, thinking about hiring, matching, screening. And we're also thinking about things on the connectivity, collaboration, scheduling end, thinking about folks who are basically required to have a smartphone now in order to coordinate all of these various gigs that they have, coordinate with all of their various clients. And again, we're not even talking about people who are working on platforms here, just folks who are stringing together lots of different types of work throughout their day, right? They're showing up for a shift at Trader Joe's, and then they might be working on construction site later that day, or they do hair out of their house or something like that, right? Basically workers, low-wage workers across the economy are required to have a smartphone and to have some kind of data plan. And this is increasingly becoming a new tax that workers have to deal with that is very unacknowledged by employers, and that is, of course, unsupported by those employers as well.
Excellent. Yeah, so that made me rearrange my notes a little bit here, because it made me want to go to this question that I think came out of some of the conversations that people were having before this panel about the way that the tech gets made invisible or sort of naturalized, right? That like the tech just develops in this way, like you planted a seed somewhere and then it grows into a surveillance app. Or the robot that I was seeing on Twitter this morning that sort of moves around a Walgreens or whatever it is and like yells and when it sees trash on the floor until a worker comes and handles it. And the way that this narrative around tech ends up affecting how workers experience it, right? Because it's not in fact just organically growing, it's being created by management in order to control workers. So because I'm doing my whatever, how that experience is being felt by workers on the floor that you're finding in all of your different work. So I'm going to go back to Julia on this one first, I think.
Yeah, I have to like show some researcher ignorance in this area, that like when, I started doing this work with precarious and insecure workers in 2014, as any good PhD student at the time, I was thinking like, oh, I'm super interested in these apps and platforms, right? And I would kind of go out and try and find people who were using them. And, I was really interested in them way back when, right? Seems like a really long time ago. And I ended up talking to all these folks who were working at jobs that, I immediately thought, oh, you're not going to be interested in my study. You're not going to qualify for my study because you're not working through an app. You're not working through a platform. And they all said, no, 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 no. I absolutely work through it. I absolutely use my phone. Absolutely I'm required to, be connected all the time so that I can, talk to my clients, so that I can schedule my shifts, so that I can move around my childcare at the drop of a hat like I need to in order to be able to show up for my shift on time because it just changed, for example. So yeah, there was a way that my assumptions as a researcher going into this were perpetuating that before I started doing this research, right? Of seeing the cell phone as like this inevitable, natural part, when really, and this is, I'm pleased to announce this is now not a dissertation, it's a book that's going to be coming out with Oxford University Press later this year. That is really looking at the ways that these technologies are kind of the invisible infrastructure of the service economy, right? Of the kind of flexible service economy, are not necessarily these apps and platforms that we've been talking about for the past couple of years, but the slightly less sexy, but very, very important mobile technologies that have been allowing us to have this kind of flexible capitalism, flexible scheduling that we've been enjoying and suffering from for the last couple of years.
Yeah, absolutely. Bill, do you want to jump in?
Well, to me, it's sort of the amazing one-sidedness of it, and our accepting of companies being able to do just in time with human beings. So even human beings who are working what we would consider normal jobs, not gig jobs, but jobs we thought were fully regulated and we're not seeing arbitrage, but in many ways they are being, the labor regulations are being arbitraged by this argument that, well, we need this flexibility with the workers. And two things. One, it ignores the property right of the worker. The idea of freedom to contract is always only interpreted from the perspective of the business person and not from the worker's perspective. So if you're not going to give me regular hours, what's the contract? Right? Because what is it I'm contracting to do? And if you're going to give me haphazard hours, then you're denying me the ability to set another contract with someone else for the hours I'm not working. And then we get the scratch your head, what kind of thing where, yes, but I'm giving them flexibility. Look, they don't have to work all the time. It's like, wait, time out, but it's not when I want to work. So the same technology that puts the game tilted towards the owner is the same technology that could have an optimal solution for workers and for management. And the fact that this then gets turned into, oh, you don't understand the technology because it couldn't work that way. It's, these contradictions that always pop up when you talk to folks in tech make you scratch your head 5 times over. Uber couldn't possibly have regular hours for the drivers. They couldn't possibly pay them on an hourly basis. And you're talking to people who are fully aware of what the market looks like, and you can't schedule me for hours that would be optimal. Why? Right? You walk away almost crazy because what they're saying makes no sense, because the technology only makes sense if it makes them wealthy. It doesn't make sense if it actually gives workers control over their hours. The technology doesn't make sense, right? If it means that I have to have a level playing field when it comes to treating you with the Fair Labor Standards Act and acting like you actually are the employee that you are. So to me, that's the sort of numbing part. This pretending, as we heard from the first panel, this pretending that they're really technology companies is the other part that we should go along with their game and insanity. Uber is a taxi company.
Yeah.
It's a taxi company.
Yep.
And I don't care what you want to say about the technology and the hoopla around it, you're a taxi company. and that I'm supposed to be befuddled because instead of little short guy, who's telling the taxi drivers where to go, as on the TV show, it's a computer. It is frustrating.
Yeah, the way that Uber's argument around Prop 22 was that they, the drivers like the flexibility, so therefore we can't possibly give them labor rights, as if the two things are somehow connected. Grisham?
So a couple things here. One thing I'd say is that, the question of how exactly is it that the companies end up having unilateral control over technology, and technology itself ends up, having these sort of mystical qualities. Well, one of the major reasons for that is that our law accepts that employers have rights to surveil workers as a fact of life, and grants rights over technology to employers, and does not grant rights to bargain or consult over technology, for the most part, to workers. There's, in the union context, you get some such rights, but of course, very few private sector workers are now unionized. There's a long history of this, which I think is worth keeping, or a long history behind this, which I think is worth keeping in mind. David Montgomery, a labor historian, wrote a book called Workers' Control in America. And one of the big themes in that book is that craft workers and factory workers in the 19th and early 20th centuries frequently resisted working while they were being monitored. They would very often refuse to actually pick up their tools if a foreman was in sight. And why was that? This was the age of Taylorism. It was the time when companies were trying to build and exert control over the labor process. And observing workers performing their tasks was the first step in that. And the workers understood exactly what was happening. So they often refused to actually, work while being supervised, but eventually lost that battle. Taylorism did come to dominate, but even in the era of Taylorism, Taylorism is often presented as efficiency promoting and productivity enhancing. But there are a lot of examples from that time of companies choosing technologies that are actually less efficient, but that led to a greater capital share. So Sam Bowles has a great example of, there was a company a canning company that put in line mechanical capping machines, basically, that were nowhere near as effective as the workers who would perform the capping prior to that. But they had the great advantage that they allowed that factory owner to actually get rid of the union that was trying to organize and have a voice in production. Okay, very briefly, so, two ways this is reflected in law right now. Within labor law, there's the distinction between mandatory and permissive subject to bargaining. And unionized workers have very few rights to bargain around technological change that leads to workers being displaced. They might have what we call effects bargaining, which is mostly about what happens to displaced workers. They do have rights to bargain around new surveillance and new forms of discipline, at least in many cases. Those rights are themselves fairly limited. And of course, those don't apply at all in the non-union context. The other place, which we haven't talked about much yet today, is privacy law and how our privacy law works in the US. The baseline assumption in the US is that companies can gather any data they want to unless and until people opt out. And workers, of course, have basically no right to opt out. There's no omnibus worker privacy legislation in the US. The California legislation doesn't apply to workers yet. It may down the line. But even the California law is still wedded to this notice and choice model. If you give notice to people and allow them to opt out, that's really, and they don't, you're allowed to gather and use data however you want. This is like the engine behind Google's development of AI. And it's the engine behind a lot of what Amazon and Facebook are doing. The alternative, at least, that's developed in the EU, and it's got its own weaknesses, would be to say companies can only gather data when it's necessary for a business purpose and subject to very strict personal privacy regulations. I think we might want to think about going even further and really giving workers rights against surveillance in the workplace as a general matter. To really cut down on the amount of surveillance that happens and the amount of data that is being gathered on workers and on their performance of work in order to start to level the playing field. And those are things Congress and state legislatures can do. Whether they're going to, is another question, of course.
Thank you. I just want to, the way that, this question affects our workers is this. When Amazon workers really complain about the inhumane and extreme, production rate, site managers, typically they blame, tech workers in Seattle. They say, no, it's not us. It's the bad guys in Seattle. We're good guys. So they try to really deflect that question and try to humanize their inhumane working conditions by blaming, one part of the company. That's one the area. The other is I would like also to point out what William alluded to. The way we see that question in our, experience in Minnesota, there's a part-time, warehouse workers where workers work 5 days, 4 hours a day. And workers have been demanding for years now and asking Amazon, okay, please let us work at least 3 days, 8 hours, so we can at least plan our lives and get other jobs or, manage our lives and organize. And community has not been doing that because they don't want to pay benefits and they want to give these folks really instability and really a reasonable schedule. That's also another experience that we see. And in any time that also workers try to speak up, surveillance is also a, operation tool to monitor workers. And in some experience, site managers come to the workers and say, hey, we saw you talking to A, B, C, D. We will try to be nice to you, stop. And sometimes they try to bribe them and offer them, managerial seat or something like that. Finally, I would like to say, I think the government also can end worker surveillance if they want to, through policy. And with this new administration, I hope that the administration will consider, steps like that.
Yeah, so we're starting to get audience questions rolling in, and I'm going to actually mash one of mine up with one of theirs because somebody, Kendra Bozarth, had asked, how can researchers and advocates better support immigrants in their organizing power? And I wanted to combine that with something I was going to ask, which was, how have these already existing power disparities along the lines of race, gender, immigration status been entrenched by technology, and sort of what can people do to help push back on that? Bill, you want to? Yeah.
Well, we have to have new labor law. We passed labor legislation in the 1930s, not thinking that everything was going to be fine, but we imagined a common level of decency. And the government stepped in during World War II to make clear that it intended workers to have a voice in bargaining. Since then, the government has removed itself, and we've been dominated by companies that took a law which really relied on mutual respect, and they ran a truck through it. So we need the passage of what is called the PRO Act. PRO is an acronym, but it also means pro for providing, pro in the positive, for workers to exercise their right, which is a human right to collectively bargain, but their right under American law. And that means that this surveillance that takes place couldn't be used against workers' chance to organize. It means that rather than what's going on in Alabama right now with the Amazon workers there who are trying to organize with forced meetings with management so management can drill in workers' heads their threats on the part of management against them organizing, both individually and collectively. Rather than the absurd thing that happened in New York, where we saw a hospital spend hundreds of thousands of dollars in the middle of a pandemic to bring in union busters and then skip line to vaccinate the union busters ahead of everybody else so that they could continue to walk around the workers to intimidate these nurses who wanted to form a union. This is the absurd level at which our law now operates. Let's not even mention that, of course, anybody you're going to organize, you have to tell them that you're going to get fired, even though you're exercising a right. So we have to change our labor laws. It has to be possible for workers to organize. It has to be possible for workers to vote without being intimidated by management on a decision that is being made for workers. And we have to have penalties. It is a law, and we let companies violate the law. And for all these people always talk about law and order, law and order, law and order. When it comes to laws that protect workers, then law and order goes out the window. And the idea that someone has to pay consequences for breaking those laws goes out the window. But all laws, if we're going to be a nation of laws, have to be enforced, and they have to have consequences if you break them. And so we have to change the law so that firms are truly discouraged from the behaviors that we see. And then the most important thing is we have to return to a level playing field. While firms are potentially using technology to collude against workers and the hiring of workers, we know that in Silicon Valley, firms made a pact, an illegal pact, which we found out about, right? To not poach each other and steal each other's workers. We don't have the ability for workers to organize across America. We've prevented, which sounds kind of esoteric, secondary boycotts, but in essence, what is prevented is, out of solidarity, if Teamsters saw a picket line at a Walmart saying, I guess Walmart didn't want things delivered. If there's a picket line, electricians could say to Walmart, I don't think you want any electrical work done here, right? Because I'm not crossing the picket line. You don't get real worker solidarity. It's prohibited under our current law. We have to return so that the labor movement can actually be a movement, so that in solidarity, the Teamsters can say, if Walmart wants to pick on these workers, it's picking on workers. And no, we're not going to help you out, Walmart. You'll have to get deliveries on your own. You have to do your own electrical work, your own plumbing work, your own everything work, because we are going to stand in solidarity with those workers. So we have to level the playing field all the way around for the individual workers who are trying to organize, but for workers, broadly speaking, so that we can act as a movement.
Julia, I think you had something to say on the subject. Yeah.
Yeah. Just actually taking off of what Bill said, I think, that there's a way that looking at labor platforms in this space actually allows us to kind of like reimagine some of the different ways that different stakeholders can be brought into this conversation. And this is something Steve Vaseli mentioned, and some of the other panelists mentioned in the last panel as well, that, we can kind of take a cue from the victories, the like successes of domestic worker organizing across the lines of mutual dependence. So thinking about how domestic workers have organized alongside their employers, their clients, right? To kind of say like, hey, we all need this work to be better. We all depend on each other. Can we figure out how to build alliances? There are lots of historical examples that are not technologically, like don't depend on technology, but that have been, engineered to draw on, and that the National Domestic Workers Alliance, some other really great domestic employer organizations like Hand in Hand have also been organizing along with domestic workers around victories in Philadelphia and elsewhere. I think the labor platforms really give us a new opportunity to do this because they were equally opaque to clients and workers, right? That like nobody knows what's going on. And so there's this moment where we can all potentially find spaces to come together to build alliances across worker kind of employer relationships that were not possible, or were not allied in their interests before, but maybe now, because around these apps that might be possible. The other kind of stakeholders that could be at play here, I want to kind of call out that the kind of COVID context here, that like one of the big things that we've seen in the gig economy, looking at these labor platforms, is that as workers have gone online to find work, to kind of try and absorb some of the unemployment that they're dealing with, some of the insecurity around unemployment, we've seen scammers really like pop up across a lot of different platforms, and also on platforms that we often don't consider labor platforms like Facebook and Craigslist, but that are nevertheless labor platforms in and of themselves. And we've seen workers really across the board, lots of different types of workers exposed to similar kinds of risks, right? Like the risk of being scammed for your financial information or something like that. Folks who are new to gig work, who don't know how to spot these scams. But again, lots of different types of workers all being exposed to the same risk by dint of the fact that they're all trying to use these platforms to find work, as potentially providing, again, a new avenue for saying like, hey, you're an Uber driver, I'm a house cleaner, I'm a TaskRabbit, you're an Instacart driver. We are all exposed to this risk of scammers, right? We're all exposed to having our information stolen in this way. We're all exposed to these common risks that the pandemic has kind of presented these potentially new avenues for, again, like unifying people that were separated before in new and different ways.
Yeah, I'm just going to add in another question from the audience to that before I see if you two have anything to say, which is that, you know, given these atrophied rights to bargain that we've been talking about, what other tactics can workers adopt in organizing around various issues at work that may or may not have to do with technology? Abdi, do you want to?
Can you tell me first on the first question? And I just want to say it's really hard to win a voice at the workplace and real tangible gains, even with union right now, due to the decline of labor movement in the US. In our case, imagine what it really looks like to fight for workers' voice without a union deciding. We feel that we are fighting racism, Islamophobia, and corporate exploitation and greed at the same time. And immigrants has been in this country really on the front lines to improve conditions for working class. Historically, before us, the Polish workers, and now we are the latest wave of that kind of the American tradition. The other thing I would like to add also, it's even within the labor movement. I come from I'm a union guy. I used to organize home care workers. I now lead a worker center, but also I would like to point out that racism and lack of inclusion also does exist within the labor movement. So the labor movement also needs to be inclusive and to open up, not only for only rank and file, but to really give folks of color, role and leadership that they deserve. Sometimes I feel, they're only a token as news. So that's also another point. It's blame with love to our brothers and sisters in the labor movement. And what can we do? What can you do to help just support folks who are on the front lines, like us, and many other brave workers who are really have been, standing up to the worst scammers in the world, despite huge power imbalance. In Minnesota, we proved that you can really, no matter where you come from, you can fight for dignity and respect and hold scammers accountable and win, at least, in short term. We understand we cannot beat Amazon alone, but at least we showed practically that when workers come together and demand dignity and respect, they can make a difference, even at a smaller scale.
Yeah, there's a question in here, or there's a couple of questions in here about opportunities for tech to work for workers, which is an interesting question. And I'm going to also throw in this question, which was for Julia specifically, about how tech mediates the work of precarious workers differently from sort of white collar workers, concerns about reachability, things like that. And Grisham, I didn't give you a chance to answer the last one, so I'm going to go to you with all of this. Whatever you want to answer and all of that I just threw at you.
Sure. Okay. So a couple things. What can workers do if they're, finding it difficult to unionize? To the extent possible, you can still protest, take disruptive action. That is protected under US law, at least for the most part. But it gets back to the point that Bill made, which is, we need to pass the PRO Act. We've got to restore rights to organize and bargain collectively. The PRO Act does a number of things that are really important here. It gives workers more of a right to strike again by overturning some of the elements of Taft-Hartley and some Supreme Court decisions that really limited their right to strike. Makes it a lot easier to get union certification, gives the NLRB the power to levy real fines against employers who violate our labor laws, which are just kind of real basic things that we need. Circling back to the question about immigrant workers and questions of racial and gender equity, the other thing that the PRO Act does is it expands the definition of employment using the ABC test in ways that would actually bring in most gig economy workers. So that would start to remedy some of those some of those barriers and some of those inequalities. I guess the other thing I would just add is, there's a lot of work that can be done at the agency level, for example, at the EEOC and Department of Labor, to use technology more affirmatively in enforcement and to begin enforcement actions more aggressively against companies that are discriminating or violating wage and hour laws. So EEOC and DOL have an awful lot of authority in both those regards. And it's a question oftentimes simply of funding, making sure that the inspectorates and the administrators in those offices have the funding they need to do their job and protect workers. But beyond that, we do need new strategies around technology, for example, to say what is permitted and what is not permitted around online hiring. How are we going to define discrimination in the hiring context, given the use of technology and data analytics in that context? And to what extent should technology, I think if a company is monitoring the performance of work, they should be held to be employing the workers. That's not the law right now, but it certainly could be.
Yeah, Julia?
Yeah, okay. So I'll do the question that was directly for me before the quick thing on the great question about technology to potentially to the benefit of workers. So a part of this study was actually to interview not just folks that we typically consider when we think about precarious work, the kind of low-wage gig workers, but also looking at white-collar gig workers, right? Essentially, folks who are, freelance writers or lawyers, or right, like lots of different kinds of jobs that are folks with higher education, but who are nevertheless still working for themselves in various ways, working from contracts, contingently employed, which means that they don't expect their jobs to last for very long. And surprisingly, I think given what we've seen in the literature is that the ways that the high wage folks and the low wage folks are using their technologies are actually really similar when you look at what they're actually relying on them for, which suggests to me that the things that we consider particularly wired or particularly skilled about white collar work are actually much more widespread than we give credence for, than we give credit for across the workforce, right? This ability to really easily and quickly respond to demands through email or text, right? Being able to use all these different types of apps and platforms to coordinate work. But the big difference, of course, is in power and privilege, right? Like the amount of power that white collar workers have to push back on clients and say, no, sorry, I can't meet that deadline is much different from the power that low wage workers do to push back on their bosses and on their clients in order to put limits on that technology.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I always like to yell about how skilled work is, all work is skilled work. There is no such thing as unskilled work. And the thing is that we often don't recognize that certain workers are skilled because of who they are, not because of the work that they're doing. Grisham had to jump off, but we are going to wrap up in just a second. I'm just going to give Abdi and then Bill a chance to answer this last question in any way they want to. Thanks. Abdi?
So for me, I just want to say, already my colleagues here touched the points I was trying to make, but I just want to say organizing works. And as someone who's really on front lines, I always, more emphasis in the field. And also, we need new innovative models, work organizing. And specifically, across the sectors. In Minnesota, we really work very closely with national groups like Athena. We work with tech workers in Seattle. They came to us, and we went to them to really create that kind of a cross-sector solidarity. And so we're all workers, no matter what we do. And and every worker really has a voice and value. And when we all come together, we can make a difference. Companies cannot work without us. So in trusting in the value of organizing, and also building a long-term strategy and investing in the organizing, I think will make a difference.
Absolutely. Bill, bring us home.
Well, I think, what you just heard from Abdi is a confirmation of what I said was the most revolutionary part of the PRO Act, which by lifting the Taft-Hartley restrictions allows workers to organize with solidarity. We always ask, why isn't there a working class movement in the United States? And it's because it's illegal. It's actually illegal. And we cannot respond without having the same solidarity on the workers' side as we do on the capital side. It's important to remember the function of organizing. Unfortunately, because we're not a nation that's really with a strong working movement mentality, we can't sort of sprinkle down one aspect of what unions do, which is to bargain. We have to create solidarity, and organizing is the way that we do that. So we need a law that allows that solidarity, recognizes that solidarity, and protects that solidarity. And I think, yes, whenever you hear economists use the term unskilled, then that means you need to do this because they're about to throw everything at you that they can. It's a pejorative, and we need to understand that's what it is. And exactly what Sarah said, it's a pejorative for people we don't have respect for. So that is my segue to, we finally need Americans to take protecting the rights of workers to get paid fairly, to not have wage theft in any of its many forms, to be able to recognize their right to organize, to vote. Those things have to be enshrined in our hearts so that we protect them, because then we can use technology. Because the reason we can't use technology to monitor firms to obey the law is because people object to it. We are all okay with state troopers having radar when we go down the road. We even have cameras that take pictures of us speeding or running a stop sign or a stoplight. We don't agree when we use technology to make sure that when I go to work and come home, I actually get a fair paycheck. And that has to stop. And that can only start when we respect workers and what all workers do.
So we need an app to track wage theft. I'm into this. But otherwise, the answers are the same as they always are, which is organizing works and organizing across sectors and across what we think of as white collar and blue collar work. Still seems to be the answer to this question. I don't know if Kate is going to pop on here and say goodbye to everyone, but I think we are at time. There she is. And thank you all so much for having me here. I really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah, and to all the panelists. That was such an awesome discussion, such skillful moderation for such a huge subject in a very short period of time. So I appreciate everyone taking the time. And also thank you to everyone who's joined us to watch today's discussions. A recording of the event, it will be posted online on YouTube. This is also a live stream, so it should be available online shortly after, and we'll also send it out through the Equitable Growth newsletter. So we'll hope everyone who will continue to follow our work on a future for all workers. Thank you, everyone.